Okay, I think we might get started. There's a few people still coming in, but by the time we've gone through the intro, they won't miss the main event. So we'll let people still filter in as we kick off. For those of you who I haven't yet met, my name is Christy Graham, the new Executive Officer of ASFI, and welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today to discuss how natural capital is embedded in financial and commercial decisions, and particularly how TNFD is developing. To start opening the webinar today by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're joining from. For me, that's the Ngunnawal people, and I'd also like to acknowledge all the custodians of the land on which you're joining from as well. I'd like to pay my respects for elders past and present and extend that respect to any Indigenous. I'd also like to acknowledge the critical role that First Nations people have played in managing land and their deep and enduring connection to land and nature, land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So this is the sixth workshop in a series run by the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, the EU Australia Climate Business Network and Climate Kick Australia, as part of a series supported by the European Union to share knowledge and support implementation of the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap. So thank you very much to our partners at the EU Climate Business Network and Climate Kick Australia. It's been a pleasure working with you. As part of this roundtable today, as you will have seen from the agenda, we've got a real apologies for that. So looking forward to a really interesting session. We'll kick off with presentations and then we'll move into a discussion for the second half of the session. So just to note that the presentation part of the session will be recorded. So please feel free to type, if you've got clarification questions, feel free to type them in the chat. There'll be a time for, at the end of some of the presentations, if you've got quick clarification questions, raise your hand and we can answer those then. But note that there's a lot more time for a detailed discussion later, and that discussion will be under Chatham House rules, won't be recorded. Given the number of people that we've got on the line, we won't do introductions at the beginning, but I would ask that when you do first speak, that you provide an introduction kind of for yourself and your organisation. So let's kick off with the agenda. The first speaker for this morning is Nicole Yazbek-Martin, who's the Director of Financing Solutions for Nature in the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment in the Australian Government. She's going to give us an update on how the Australian Government is supporting TNFD and her views on how the process is likely to develop. So thanks very much for joining.
Thank you very much, Christy, and thank you to everyone for the kind invitation for us to start engaging on this process. We also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which I sit, which is the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to anyone of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent in the chat today. So what I'll be doing is just really giving a bit of an overview of what the Australian government is doing to shift financial flows towards nature positive outcomes, and then focus particularly on our recent support and engagement with the TNFD and how we can potentially see working with the private sector going forward to make this a reality. So I am the director of the Financing Solutions for Nature team, which sits in the Climate Adaptation and Resilience division. We have quite a broad mandate within our team, which is basically to increase private investment in Australia's natural capital by helping to embed nature considerations into financial decision making. We have a series of initiatives which were underpinned by budget announcements in the last federal election budget, and from those budget announcements, we've put together a comprehensive work program that will help try and achieve those objectives. So we have three broad outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. The first is to recognize natural capital. So currently at the moment, and I think you guys will be very aware, at least from a financial point of view, natural capital is just not recognized in our mainstream economic system. So we want to look at ways to engage and recognize natural capital and get it to be understood as a financial asset class that is integral to economic prosperity in Australia and globally. And once you're able to recognize natural capital, you can start to get an understanding of the value that it brings. So another key outcome is to ensure that the ecosystem services and benefits that flow from natural capital are fully valued, but are also utilized. And I think we'll recognize countless examples where the solution that nature can provide is often discarded for another solution in, for example, the infrastructure space, where nature provides a perfectly um, healthy service, which is just not recognized and not taken into account when we're trying to find solutions to problems. And then we want to increase that investment. So once we're able to recognize and value it, we're able to start to look at how private sector can invest in nature-based solutions and start to fund and reward nature positive management practices. So we have a policy program that spans three key areas. The first is our natural capital metrics program for productive land. We've chosen productive land as a key starting point because it's where the public private overlap is most obvious. You have private ownership, you have an economic outcome, and over 60% of Australia's land is managed by private landholders. So we're looking to develop a natural capital sustainability benchmarks in co-design with the private sector that will be used by the finance sector to help to start to integrate natural capital considerations and utilize these benchmarks in financial products and services. It's going to be informed by quite strong, robust evidence that we'll be working with our key partners in the CSIRO and with our statistical agencies, namely ABARES and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, to help to develop this work. And on top of that, starting to look at what set of national accounts the Australian government can start to produce that will help to get natural capital, I guess, on the balance sheet of Australia and then filter down to the private sector. So part of the valuation piece is working with our environmental economic accounts teams to develop a set of natural capital wealth accounts, both in the terrestrial and for ocean ecosystems. And then we'll also be looking to work with the finance sector, with individuals to trial approaches on utilizing these sustainability benchmarks and using the metrics that underpins that to develop financial products, so that we can start to develop a user cases and prove that this is possible and viable in the finance sector. On the other side, in our oceans, we're doing a similar program of work, but noting that there are very key differences between investing in the terrestrial space, particularly on productive land, where you have a business outcome and private ownership. So in the ocean space, it is mainly public commons. The beneficiaries are varied, and it's very much place based in a lot of instances. And so, attracting investment into blue oceans economy is a trickier piece. So our recognition piece is looking more at some of the systematic issues that are being faced, particularly in the intersection between the oceans and blue infrastructure. And so we're working with an industry coalition, which includes uh, Infrastructure Australia, Engineers Australia, people from representing the insurance sector, and others, to start to look at what some of the systematic barriers are to the incorporation and adoption of nature-based solutions in coastal infrastructure investments, particularly when it comes to looking at future-proofing and resilience building along coastal communities. And a primary example of that would be the considerations for restoring a wetland ecosystem as opposed to building great infrastructure like a seawall to protect coastal communities from future coastal inundation as climate change starts to take effect. So we're doing quite an extensive work program with the coalition, and also working again underpinned by our quite robust science programs, including the Natural Environment Science Program, and with CSIRO and others, to bring forward the almost a quite substantial body of evidence that's starting to show how building and restoring coastal ecosystems can actually build a lot of resilience and also provide economic benefits to multiple beneficiaries, including coastal local councils who need to reduce sediment runoff in their water catchment areas and the like. So, as part of this program, we're actually developing a model, I guess you can call it an investment tool. Uh, that will demonstrate the changing condition of obviously measure the changing condition of ecosystems and demonstrate their financial value and co-benefits and also identify the beneficiaries and try to do that at a point or a price point that would enable private sector funding into bond structures and the like and get that going at scale. So those are two, I guess, on the ground things that we're doing in Australia at the moment. But I think one of the things that we're definitely recognised is that we need to drive demand and we need to drive understanding at a global level. Finance is not local; it doesn't understand borders in the same way that other policy does. And I think there was a clear recognition from our side and from the government side that the financial flows are following the global financial rules. And so, when we saw the TNFD, we really saw this as and as it was developing, we really saw this as an opportunity for Australia to take the front foot and say, we have a lot of expertise. We have a huge landmass. We have a huge agricultural system. We have experience, and we can actually contribute to this in a positive way and help develop a framework and a system that is going to drive demand for nature and start to drive nature positive outcomes through private investment. And so Minister Ley announced at COP26 on Nature Day that Australia would be joining the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures and that we would become strategic funding partners. What that strategic funding enables us to do is to sit on the Stewardship Council of the TNFD together with other strategic funding partners like the United Kingdom, Switzerland, France and others. Significantly, we are the only current Stewardship Council member that is in our region. And I think that in and of itself highlights the importance of someone like Australia to join the forum because, there a lot of the focus at the moment, and all the other Stewardship Council members are European, and that's a great thing. But there are very vastly different experiences across the world, and I think it's very important for a global framework like this to be globally represented and for the experiences and the needs of nature across the world to be well represented for this to become a significant framework that has broad uptake. So the Australian government is really our thinking behind the TNFD is really we were looking to say what can we do to support the framework to become a success. What can we do to embed the understanding of natural capital and nature risk and dependencies both across the public sector because there is a huge education piece across our economic agencies, across my own division and department, which is quite a massive department, and and the Australian business community more broadly speaking. And so we are really looking to our program of work to support the TNFD is really looking to stand on three pillars. The first is an education piece, which is going to start mainly internally and working across the federal government through with our economic agencies and then also with states and territories. So we'll be working in close partnership with all interested states and territories to see how we can get the understanding of nature and nature risk embedded across government and then looking at what role we can play in terms of providing information to the private sector more broadly. With our stakeholder engagement, we would like to be very active working in partnership with people with organizations like the ASFI and others across the business community, so not just in the financial services sector, to really engage with the TNFD process and to get a better level of understanding across the Australian private sector of what nature is and what nature risk is. And particularly, I think, with when the beta framework comes out, we will be very interested to work with like-minded private sector individuals to see, are they willing to test the beta framework and provide us with information about what's working, what's not working, what information they need to support them, what data gaps are available, where does it not fit Australia's circumstances. And so the Australian government can really both feed that information up to the TNFD forum, but also that it can start to develop a policy around how it can support the private sector when the framework becomes operational in 2023. And then lastly, our work with the TNFD, it is very aligned with government policy, both in the region, so our regional outreach to our regional neighbours, as well as recent government policy around particularly adaptation and the recognition and valuing of nature. So many of you will be aware that Australia and Singapore are currently at the beginnings of negotiating a green economy agreement, which is a world first in terms of the nature and structure of the agreement. And we'll be seeking to work very closely with our Singaporean counterparts to see how nature and TNFD can be supported through this process. It's also been a focus point of the G20 under Italy's presidency, and some of you may know that Indonesia, which is a close regional partner of ours, will be taking over the presidency in 2021. They have a vast amount of natural resources and natural capital. I think someone quoted the other day up to 20% of all nature and nature-based solutions can actually come from that region. And so we work very closely already with Indonesia on our blue carbon partnerships, on forestry and others, and it would be a great opportunity for us to continue that outreach under this banner. And then there are some significant events happening next year, most importantly, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is, I think, really just going to capitalize on this and leading up into next year's COP, which will be a COP focused on adaptation. And we all know that nature-based solutions can play a key role in that. Just lastly, I just want to highlight some of the other government policies that are well aligned with this and where we're going to be trying to work very closely with our other policy colleagues is that the National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy, colloquially termed the NCRAS, was recently released, and it has a couple of key pillars, one of them being partnership with the private sector to work towards building a resilient future for Australia, and nature-based solutions is a key mechanism through which we have identified we'll be able to do this. So I think as we're looking at how that the TNFD can both elevate that and elevate the status of nature-based solutions into adaptation and resilience planning where it makes sense to do so. I've mentioned already our forward work program and our environmental economic accounts, and I think Australia's desire to be world leaders in publishing national natural capital terrestrial and ocean ecosystem accounts. And the government has also recently announced it will be putting forward legislation to start to put up a biodiversity stewardship market, which will start to look at how we can recognize biodiversity units and increase investment and add value to those in a market setting. So I'll leave it at that and happy to take questions after the presentations, but please feel free to put any comments or questions in the chat in the meantime.
Thanks very much, Nicole. It's great to get a good sense of the breadth of engagement that you and your team and the Australian government more broadly has on natural capital, and particularly to hear a bit more detail around your objectives in TNFD and how we might be able to continue to work together as we develop further. So thank you very much. So next up, we'll hear from Guy Williams, who's the Director of Biodiversity and Natural Capital at Deloitte, and Carolyn Leisha, who's Head of Social and Sustainable Finance, Natural Capital and Biodiversity at KPMG. They're both ASFI members, but they also both sit on the TNFD task force, and it's with this perspective that they'll provide an overview of the task force, key priorities over the next 12 to 18 months, and perspectives on next steps. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much to ASFI for having us today. My name is Guy Williams, and as Christy said, I'm a director at Deloitte. I'm calling in today from my home of the south coast town of Kiama, the land of the Wadi Wadi and Dharawal people. Just important to recognise the word Kiama is derived from the Aboriginal word Kiarama, which means the place where the sea makes a noise. For those of you who are familiar with Kiama, this big noisy blue, its big blowhole and the wonderful hinterland of green guides pretty much everything that we do and serves as my daily connection to country. I work quite closely with our Indigenous business seeking to rebuild and apply a very well-developed and integrated approach to accounting for and valuing nature and natural capital, and seeking to bring together this Indigenous and Western ecological knowledge systems. I always think it's important that we acknowledge there is no place in Australia, water, land or air, that has not been known, nurtured and loved by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that's the framing for all the work that I do at Deloitte. As Christy also said, I also work on the membership group of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure. And Carolyn and I just want to give you a quick introduction to how that's progressing. In addition to the role in the membership, I also now co-lead Working Group 1, which is around defining nature-related risk. And that's kind of helping to establish some of the key definitions and framing that the actual BETA framework and the disclosure frameworks were built upon. So that work's all very much active and underway and keeps me up late most evenings, but it's work that I'm really enjoying. So just, background, which I think is familiar to everybody, is that, nature loss is a growing risk to the economy. We're seeing it increasing up the list of priority issues from executive level, and nature is very much on the agenda of these business decisions. We're seeing, a lot of fantastic work at a global level and also at a national level, linking economic output to its dependency upon nature. And also a reliance that as these natural systems and ecosystems do fail, and they are failing, and we are seeing increasing species losses, that presents obviously a key material risk to the economy. And also something which I suppose for many of us has been known for a long time is that biodiversity and nature is a material risk to every business. The process that have happened over the last 5-10 years to quite often devalue nature and biodiversity by business has been obviously understandably linked to its inherent complexity and the lack of a real clear way for actually accounting for the value and also the risk associated with nature. So as Nicole presented, a lot of the work that the government's doing in both filling in the gaps around data and also helping to bring together some of these accounting systems are really fundamental. But despite these, the increasing relevance, materiality and concern over nature and how it impacts upon business systems, there's also been a real clear consensus across the board, and particularly in the finance sector, that there is a need in order for us to manage this risk that we can first measure the exposure. And the TNFD has come out of a shared calling for a common risk management and disclosure framework. And that calling has been happening for some time. And it's really culminated in the TNFD initiative. The TNFD, which is now gaining quite rapid traction and really progressing quite quickly, is something that's actually a long phase of work that's kind of come before this initial focus. And I think Carolyn and KPMG and others who were involved in the initial preparatory phase in the informal working group from 2020 right through until when the TNFD was kind of officially launched in June 2021, a lot of work has already gone into scoping how this could play. And it puts us in a really good position to make sure that the work that we do now to develop a BETA framework and get it ready for road testing and piloting is based on some really solid foundation. Also to kind of clarify that the framework that's being developed is not a new standard. It may be a new acronym, and that I know presents some concern and consternation to many like myself, whose head is filled of too many acronyms. It's a new acronym, but it is obviously very closely aligned with and built upon the framework of the TCFD. So for those of you who are familiar with the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure, we'll take a lot of solace in seeing some very familiar features across that. And also it is actually recognizing and providing a portal to access a whole range of existing reference standards which kind of come before it, which are really important. So it's not looking to create anything particularly new, apart from just enabling better accessibility and consistency. So in June 2021, the TNFD officially launched, and it had the widespread support from financial institutions, corporates, and as Nicole has said, from government as well as civil society. And this has kind of led to the need to then get on with the process of essentially building a framework, which is step one. And the second step, which happens in parallel, is building momentum to get it ready for market adoption. I'll get to timeframes in a second, but I think it is important just to flag is that the beta framework is due out end of February, early March. And that will become available initially for forum members, those who are already registered and engaged in the process, to actually chew and see what it means for them. And then obviously it'll be open to the broader society after that. The ultimate deadline that we're all working towards is September 2023. And we've already seen signals from some financial institutions that there will be mandated disclosure to some aspects, highly impacted aspects of the society, of the economy, and of their investment community by that first date. So there is a real bit of a mad rush at the moment, and we're certainly feeling it, the likes of Carolyn and myself, in terms of the interest and engagement from organizations who are saying, gosh, September 2023 is just around the corner. What do we need to do to get prepared? But we'll get to that in a second. So these kind of core guiding principles, which I think are really important, the usability, making sure that it's accessible for those who are coming into this as a very new risk category, they need to be able to access it. And so the consistency of language, the clarity of language, we can get very complex. And for folks like myself, I'm an ecologist by birth and by training, and I love getting deep into the science of this. But to use biodiversity, nature, natural capital, ecology, ecosystem services interchangeably in one sentence is very confusing and doesn't help. So I use that as an example. Please don't quote me on that. And that's, we need to try and get some real clarity over what we mean. How does this relate to climate? How does it relate to other aspects of environmental management that are already well underway and progressed within financial institutions? So these are some of those questions. The science base is essential and important. I think Nicole really really presented that really well. We have a fantastic science base. There has been some extremely smart people, far smarter than myself, working on some of the science behind this, the metrics, the data, the targets, so we can build upon that. Purpose-driven, not just focusing on risk, but also considering opportunity and how does this enable new markets and new investment, really important. That it's integrated and adaptive. So as I've mentioned, it's integrated with existing reporting, existing strategy, existing targets, and to a large extent, integrated with what's happening around TCFD and climate-related disclosure. The climate-nature nexus is important. We probably don't need to unpack this on this call, but nature by its very definition is the umbrella that includes both the biotic and the abiotic. So it includes the land, it includes the species, it includes water, and it also includes climate. So how do those two things work together as being seen as two kind of possibly competing processes within an organization and its investment decisions? The nature-related risks is obviously core, and that's around how we frame it, and that globally inclusive. Once again, and I think we'll hear from Swiss Re later around what this meaning here locally versus the trends that we're seeing internationally. And I think that's also a very strong focus of the Commonwealth federal government's involvement in this program, is to make sure that this is not just for European financial institutions led by European financial institutions, but it also pays respect to the unique ecology and the unique economy that we face here in Australia. So just kind of very quickly, it's seeking to really benefit and to gain input from a range of different stakeholders across the finance sector and across the economy at large. So financial institutions should be able to pick up the TNFD to make sense of it, and it will help them to make informed and robust capital allocation decisions. This is the dream. Yeah, this is what we're working towards, is making sure that every step we come back and check that it fulfills these requirements. For analysts that who are involved in syndicate desks or trades and transactions can also use the TNFD to use related environmental and natural capital information and data sets to determine the impacts on cash flow and company valuations. That companies, all sorts of organizations, can use a framework to access the information and mainstream it into their reporting, their sustainability reporting and their financial reporting. So this really does enable that integrated sustainability reporting goal. And this point around companies is really important because it's being heavily inclusive to include a whole range of different organizations beyond just finance. So customers, clients, investors of ours, of those people on the call today, across a range of sectors from agriculture, built environment, energy, are heavily encouraged to get involved in this process because it will have direct and material impact on them as well. Regulators, in addition to the program of support that's being provided by the government, but regulators can also be able to benefit from the framework as a method for compliance. That's something that we're going to see in terms of the mandatory nature of compliance. Stock exchanges, and then finally accounting firms like Deloitte. We like to see this consistency in terms of how the financial and the non-financial are valued and how they can bring together with other different data sets, and so it's providing a real sense of unification for us. Just briefly on the structure of the TNFD. It's led by two co-chairs. We also have a secretariat and a stewardship council, which Nicole has mentioned includes some of the funding partners and some of the government partners, providing direct guidance and advice both to the forum and to the membership. We have these 35 task force members, and I'll get to who they are in a moment, but that's now that those 35 have been locked in. They're really the folks that are rolling up their sleeves as we speak now, and are split up into a series of working groups to develop the beta framework, to prioritize and target certain organizations and industries for pilots, and to make sure that this actually ticks all of those guiding principles I mentioned before. Split into a number of working groups, and then beneath that we have the forum. The forum is currently at over 200 organizations and continue to grow. It's essentially, there is no cap on that. That reflects those organizations that are actively interested and engaged in seeing how the TNFD develops. That's most logically the group from which pilots are drawn, but not necessarily, not exclusively. You may not be involved in the forum and still participate as either an official or an unofficial pilot. But certainly in terms of the first release of outputs, so the beta framework, any kind of the supplementary document around definitions of nature-related risk, that forum is the first off the rank to see it, to review it, to thrash it about. And we're also extremely fortunate to be supported by a knowledge hub, which includes the Brains Trust, those people who have been working on this issue for a very long time, including those from NGO, academic, civil society in the research hub. And we also have a standards hub. So that includes all of those other organizations that have set similar aligned standards, such as GRI and others, who we can draw on to make sure that we're not reinventing wheels. So here's a page of logos, and a very important page on the left. You have the 34 at that stage. It's now been increased. We've appointed the final 35th member of the representative membership. And for each of those, they have a single executive level representative from those organizations involved in the membership of developing the framework, and a second representative who's also involved in supporting. So we have essentially 70 individuals from senior and executive levels within those organizations who are actually driving the framework itself. We then have those over 200 organizations involved in the forum, and I've just done a very quick snapshot of organizations that are quite closely aligned with us on the call, both in terms of members of financial institutions here in Australia. And I do apologize if you're on the call, if you're already part of the forum. It's a dynamic and growing group, and I haven't represented your logo there. But you can also see there New South Wales and Queensland government, in addition to the Commonwealth government. Federal government are signed up as forum members, and we have other organisations such as RIA, and I note Simon O'Connor from RIA is on the call today. So we have that, and that becomes a really useful kind of process. And this I'll move over this quite quickly, but this is just to kind of show that across those 35 organisations, there's a relatively high scale of impact that we've been able to gain, both in terms of global reach, organisations like KPMG and Deloitte, in terms of our access to markets and client bases across most parts of the globe, but also in terms of influence and the role of both financial institutions that are driving capital, both into nature negative and hopefully transitioning into nature positive investment pathways, are well represented. And then thirdly, and I think really importantly, is making sure that we have organizations that may not be from the finance sector, but are at risk both from requirements of disclosure and also are at risk in terms of driving the patterns we see around nature loss and biodiversity decline. And so there's a really targeted and useful mix of organizations across consumer goods, agriculture, infrastructure and extractives and energy represented in that membership. So this one, I'll go over this quickly. I think Carolyn might touch on this just after I run through these slides, but in terms of, how the TNFD is looking to get support from other, from forum members and others, certainly by signing up to the TNFD, you get access to insights ahead of the rest. You have the ability to participate in plenary sessions and webinars, and there's that shared learning platform. There's all sorts of related reference documents that are being shared across that learning platform. And certainly the TNFD benefits from having as much interest and participation as possible. Really for Australia and New Zealand, we are hoping to get as many different members of the finance sector involved in the TNFD over the next kind of 12 to 18 months leading up to that September phase. And if we were able to do that, then I think that would be step one in having a very successful process in making the most of this opportunity. Just for those, just finally in terms of the structure, the TNFD is following a very similar kind of structural build as we've seen for the TCFD. In many cases, organisations that are already progressed in their TCFD disclosure don't need to pens down and then start again. There is a real clear opportunity to build upon existing work that's done. So that includes things around metrics and targets. Yes, there are some unique features around nature, but there is also opportunity to bring in insights from climate in terms of things like Scope 3 emissions and how you source offsets for those. I'm looking at nature-based climate solutions and how those two things feed together. The need for clarity around governance is a real key component of the disclosures that we're going to see in the BETA framework. The need for strategy, for support at a senior executive level throughout the organisation, and to make sure that the importance of disclosing on nature-related risks is built into organisational strategy and investment strategy, and obviously that it's clearly linked to risk management and existing risk management. The structure of the work at the moment is we have these 5 working groups. The first 3 are what I call the foundational working groups. They kind of need to happen before we can move on to the next part. They're kind of like the building blocks, essentially. As I've mentioned, we have the first one, working group 1, around nature-related risk, which I'm heavily involved in and can possibly answer some questions if we have time at the end in terms of what's being discussed there, but that's a really active and dynamic group. Macquarie Bank, for example, are another Australian firm represented on that working group. We also have other working groups around data availability and standards and metrics. And then this work all then builds through to those cross-cutting working groups around the BETA framework itself, how dense and how accessible and what form should that take. And then that final point around pilots and pilot methodology is a really important thing. So as I've mentioned before, the time frame is ambitious. I think it's necessarily ambitious. And early 2022, that late February, early March for the release of the BETA framework. And we'll obviously keep in very close contact with ASFI, as well as with Nicole and her team to make sure that relevant members and interested members of the economy here can gain access to that BETA framework. And then there is these ongoing points of engagement. Pilots we'll get to in a moment, but both official and unofficial pilots are a great way for organisations to involve, then right through to that September 2023 release, and then we'll obviously see it expanding out. So just finally, there's a number of things that you can all do and that we can encourage to do amongst our networks, and we probably see a range of different responses from organisations. We're already seeing this. Those who are seeing a bit of a wait and watch brief, and to see how this plays out and see how it shapes up against other frameworks and standards. But definitely my advice to those involved in that camp is that the TNFD and nature as an issue, as we've seen from COP26, is certainly not going away or being devalued or deprioritized any soon. And then there's a number of different things you could do in terms of internal preparedness. What do you currently have that's useful to support possible disclosure, right through to actually engaging with the TNFD Secretariat as a pilot. So we obviously encourage you to take a more proactive view and to reach out to the TNFD itself and look for opportunities to kind of get involved. I'll hand over to Carolyn.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. No, you've done a terrific job actually covering off so comprehensively. So I might just touch on where we're at in the process. So as Guy mentioned, you know, the TNFD actually adopted a strong market and member-led approach, and also pleasingly, given the complexity of the task at hand, the TNFD also recognized the need to be nimble and will be guided by an open innovation and rapid co-design sprint. So we're not just waiting actually, like, you know, for the next 2 years, you know, and present the actual risk and disclosure framework on a silver tablet. It will be actually like a very participatory process actually in itself. So we're now in phase 1, the build phase. And as Guy said, you know, each of the 5 working groups actually started to review and really break down key research questions into a subset of more granular questions to guide the delivery and the resourcing of the research work going forward. It's worthwhile to remind ourselves, you know, that the TNFD is actually not looking to create a new standard. Rather, it's really looking to create a framework that can be applied to many different existing standards, methods, and taxonomies. So we as members are currently going through a process of really understanding the landscape of practice and figuring out how the TNFD can most effectively fit into the existing ecosystem. So at this stage, it's really about getting the initial common baseline work undertaken across the different working groups to understand and map out the overall landscape of practice at a high level, and then build the superstructure and bring these insights into the actual BETA framework. So the BETA framework itself actually is targeted to be released for the end of February and March next year, which is rolling around at a rate of knots. And, you know, as Guy mentioned, I think, you know, importantly, that there will be plenty of opportunities to test and pilot the framework and provide the feedback loops to help shape it and really increase the usability by the market participants. So really looking ahead, you know, what to expect and how to get involved. Perhaps as market awareness grows, you know, it is likely that the TNFD will follow a similar trajectory to the TCFD, where there will be increasing corporate and prudential regulatory and market pressure on banks, you know, asset managers, insurance, and corporates to adopt the framework as standard practice. You would have seen on the other slide that Guy showed 45% of the TNFD members overlap with the TCFD. So in time, we can expect that nature and biodiversity related financial disclosures to be required in the same way as climate change. And it's now also expected by capital markets and increasingly required, you know, by regulators. So perhaps, you know, lastly, I wanted to, you know, just highlight and reiterate, you know, the call out for any organizations, whether it's financial institutions, corporates, regulators, business consortium and NGOs and other research organizations who are taking an interest in the TNFD and wishing to contribute towards the development of the framework and really test and pilot it on portfolios and become part of the enabling ecosystem for it to flourish, to join the TNFD forum. The TNFD forum is an open member consultative group. It's already, I think, has about over 250 forum members, and you can express your interest, you know, to join this forum on the TNFD website. So I'll leave it here, and we can open up for questions later on in the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Guy and Carolyn. I might just see if there's any clarification questions that people have now. Feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. But it looks like there aren't any. You've done a great job of explaining, I guess, how it's evolved, how it's progressing, and the cracking pace that you're setting with the development of the BETA framework. And also great to hear that call out to organisations who are interested to be a part of and provide feedback to the development, ongoing kind of improvement of those standards as well. So keen to cover off a bit more on that in the discussion in a little while. But before we do that, we'll move to Cherie Gray. So Cherie is the Global Head of Sustainability and Market Development with RE. and she'll provide a financial services sector perspective on why natural capital is important and the work of the TNFD is important and what Swiss Re is already doing in this area. So over to you.
Great, thanks very much. While I guess I've got some slides to come up, but I guess just to introduce myself, I do a global role now back home in Sydney. And it is a bit of a privilege because even though it does mean late nights to keep in touch with everything that's going on, it also is a great opportunity to showcase the innovative stuff that is going on in Australia. And after listening to Nicole, it just really confirms that it's actually quite an exciting time, here in Australia. So if we move to the next slide, just to introduce Swiss Re. So we are a global reinsurer and insurer. So what that means is that we actually sit behind the insurers, but we also have specialised businesses that work directly with corporates. We also work with government, institutions and development banks. And our purpose is to make the world more resilient. And what that means is to close what we call the protection gap. So if you see, the stats around the number of risks that are not well enough insured or just remain completely exposed, there's a lot of opportunity for improvement out there, which we aim to change. So on the next slide, you'll see what the trends look like, although I'm sure you won't be surprised to see this happening. But what's becoming, I guess, more alarming is that, climate change, it's no longer a risk, it's becoming a fact, right? And it challenges the notion of what's insurable. Insurance is about probabilities. It's not about the inevitable and fact. So this is something that we've been talking about for quite a while. And if you look at the trend lines, if you look at the bars, you'll see like the dark green, which is actually the insured losses, and then the light green, which is the uninsured losses, of which there's obviously a lot of gaps. But what you don't see is what's actually unrecorded. So the economic losses that we have that aren't recorded, and this is where all of the natural capital sits. So all of these assets that we rely on and have that actually aren't really documented in any sort of economic or insurable capacity. And so the next slide drills down a little bit further into what it looks like for Australia. So apologies if it's small, but if you look at the charts, you can see again the upward trend. And a lot of that is being driven by, so SCS stands for severe convective storms. So that's essentially the big thunder, hail, kind of aggressive storms. And of course, wildfires. And that's what's actually increasing the losses over the last 50 years. And then if you look at some of the stats on the right, this is just from last year. And, I'm sure we will all just reflect on just the last 2 years have just been crazy in terms of the natural events that we've had, particularly in terms of flooding. And just to call out some of the stats, I mean, the natural catastrophe losses that we've had, 3.5 billion of insured losses out of, the total of insured losses. It just shows that Australia is actually one of the highest exposed regions in terms of natural catastrophes. But there's still a protection gap. And we're actually one of the most mature markets in the world in terms of our insurance coverage and how we manage it. But again, those numbers still don't include natural assets and the economic benefits that are derived from natural capital. So what do they look like? On the next slide, we've just got a couple of stats. I probably don't need to tell you about the global dependencies that we have on biodiversity and ecosystem services. The 55%, 44 trillion is a number that is thrown around a lot. But the challenge is actually bringing that down to a meaningful level. So getting it to the right level to actually drive action and decision making. So even if we just talk about one ecosystem, for example, coral reefs, the amount of money that they generate just in terms of tourism related activities, 36 billion. But that's actually nothing compared to the value that they provide in terms of resilience and protection. So 7 times, that value. And even mangroves. I mean, mangroves are just really cool in the sense that they store carbon, they're so resilient, but they're also protecting over 15 million people who live right on the coastline and are actually threatened by, high levels of storm surge. So what do we do about it? How is Swiss Re approaching this? So the next slide shows a bit of our journey that we've taken internally. I mean, it's a bit busy, but I'll just call out some highlights. 1979 was actually when we first launched publications and commentary about climate-related risks and impacts to biodiversity. I think we called it ecology then, guys. So, the terminology is still all over the place. But we were talking about it before it was cool, before people really started to notice it. And then we've since kind of made our own journey. One of the key things that we've done in 2009, so for the last 20 odd years, we've actually formalized what we call our sustainable business risk framework. So this is where we actually have, I guess, integrated policy and decision making in our business, where we will do no harm to the environment and to human rights. And this is actually embedded in all of our decision making. So it just really sets the standard for how we operate. In terms of our learning and experience when it comes to nature-related metrics, we first got involved with the TEEB, so the economics of ecosystems, quite some time ago. And last year, we actually launched our own biodiversity and eco-services index. So this is where we actually did the research and took, I guess, a snapshot or a baseline of the vulnerable ecosystems and what that means to our portfolio. So it was only really just the next logical step for us to join the TNFD. Our special interest there, as you can imagine, is the metrics area, because we believe that we've already done a lot of work in this space, and this is where we can really contribute, but also refine our own approaches. And this sits, I guess, underneath our broader sustainability strategy, which includes some net zero targets that we committed to a couple of years ago. So for us, that is 2030 for all of our operations and 2050 across the entire business. So that means our underwriting portfolios and our asset management portfolios. So all the people that we do business with in terms of the businesses that we insure and that we invest in, we want to be net zero by 2050. So on the next slide, I've just got a bit of a deep dive into our sustainable business risk framework. So like I mentioned, this has been around for quite some time, and you can see the umbrella policies that we have around human rights and environmental protection. But you can also see the specific sectors that we focus on. And it's regularly reviewed. So, 2019 is when we revised and started to withdraw and change our policies out of oil and gas and thermal coal. And this year we reviewed our policies against forestry and logging, and particularly considering the, I guess, the emergence of forestry, particularly for its carbon value. Now, so we are constantly reviewing, and it's a process that is just embedded into our business. So it sets a really good baseline for us. So our baseline, essentially, if we avoid any harm, we're already at neutral as our minimum standard. So the activities that we do on top of that are already going to be positive or nature positive. So I'll move on and talk about what we're doing to support our clients. So how our internal work actually translates externally. So on the next slide are some examples. So the first is around, I guess, awareness, because we do want to help our clients transition. We're not just going to withdraw and leave them with nowhere to go. We actually want to support them through the process. So awareness and identification is the first step. And as a global reinsurer, we've collected loads of data over the years and can really offer some insights and comparisons and benchmarks. The image that you can see on the right there is a snapshot of our biodiversity index. And I mean, you can see that that's kind of the dryness layer, because Australia is all red there. And so that's just a holistic view of, some of the insights that we can provide. And what we've been able to do is we've been able to integrate those views into our CatNet database, which is the database that also holds the flood maps, the storm tracks, the earthquake data. And so when you actually overlay the biodiversity layers with the natural hazards, you get some really interesting information that can actually help planning and decision making when it comes to selecting sites or managing a portfolio of assets. So the second opportunity is to use insurance to actually protect and restore natural assets. And this is where, in particular, the use of index-based insurance, as opposed to traditional indemnity-based insurance, provides a real opportunity. So index-based covers are based on objective data. So when you have a trigger that happens, as opposed to in traditional insurance, when the damage is done and then the loss adjuster has to go out and assess it, after the house is burnt down. So a good example is just to describe what we did in Mexico, where we actually created an insurance solution for the coral reef. So the index, or the trigger, was actually the wind speed. So in Mexico, they're quite vulnerable to hurricanes. And in the state of Quintana Roo, the reef there, the beach actually gets annihilated when the hurricanes come through. And what that means is that all the tourism businesses close, the reef, gets destroyed because the sediment stays there, the fragments get broken, and it's just been deteriorating. So the insurance product was designed that if the hurricane passes through, a defined area at a certain speed, there is an insurance payout. And what that payout does is it actually funds quick response and restoration activity. So there's a team of awesome humans called the Reef Brigades that actually go out in the boats, they dive down, they actually collect the fragments, they actually secure the large ones, replant the broken ones, help to clear the sediment. And that fast action actually, prolongs the deterioration. So it means that the businesses can actually get back to work a lot faster, because that community is so dependent on the tourist activity. So that's an example where, that model can actually be applied to different ecosystems, where there is a weather event or something where mitigation and resilience building is really important. The third opportunity is to use insurance to enable and de-risk natural infrastructure. So we would love to see more green infrastructure, more green grey infrastructure. And the idea is that you treat it just like any other commercial project. Just because it's green doesn't mean that you have to actually forego the normal assurances and standards and compliance that you would for a normal grey project. Mm-hmm. So the picture that you see down the bottom right there is Texel Island in the Netherlands. And this was a really cool project because it was a dike that actually was at risk of failure. So it needed to be reinforced or rebuilt. So it's a concrete dike. But Texel Island is actually a World Heritage listed site. There's a lot of local communities there. And the idea that the municipality came up with was to actually reinforce it with sand and make a nature-based solution. So the construction actually involved 5 million cubic meters of sand being, manipulated around the area. But because it was new, because it was different, there was high risk, they needed to also provide the the insurances for it to happen. So we provided, I guess, a standard contract works cover, which meant that the municipality was protected against delays, against damages, against mistakes, which created in turn a lot of confidence for the project to go ahead. And so the project was completed on time and on budget. But it was actually a really great outcome because, I mean, you can see it looks really lovely. It's really beautiful. But there was also increased co-benefits. They had improvements in the fish production, water quality as well because of this exercise. And then the last area to consider is something that, you know, it's a very hot topic right now is around carbon removal as a market. And what we see is that there is certainly opportunity and a need for it to scale up and to professionalise. And we see insurance and risk transfer solutions as a way to do that. A lot of it can be repurposed from our agriculture capabilities, particularly when it comes to soil carbon and forestry. But there's also a lot of other things that we can do to actually help scale up and de-risk. So we'll move on to the next slide and I guess just talk about some other examples that might relate to, you know, all of your businesses and your clients. So what is it that we can all do? What else can you do now? So if you aren't already thinking about it, you can probably categorize a lot of your current activities into this framework. I mean, this framework isn't new: avoid, reduce, restore, transform. But I've chosen to showcase it today because it's an approach that we're taking with the World Economic Forum. So I sit on the Global Future Council for Nature-Based Solutions. And together what we're trying to do, we're going to be releasing a publication early next year. And the intention is to actually show what's possible, what's achievable in order for nature positive financial flows. And the intention is that if we provide these examples in a simple framework, then we can share the learnings and others can just easily pick it up, copy, enhance, take it for their own, but also recognise where there are gaps and where we need to work together. And the TNFD is a really great example of that. So you don't have to work sequentially, and I've put, you know, examples in there from Swiss Re experience just to demonstrate that. I mean, I'm sure most of you already have some kind of volunteering days or some kind of, you know, foundation opportunities which are already making an impact and making a difference. For us, we use the Swiss Re Foundation to support resilience, and coastal resilience has become, you know, quite a focus area there in terms of protecting the natural ecosystems. So there's some ideas there, and it also intends to show you that it's not insurmountable. You know, you just get started. We don't need to wait for the perfect framework or solution. What we can do is actually get started, and then we can plot it into, you know, the framework. As Guy mentioned, it's meant to be integrative and accessible. So there's no need for you to stop and wait. You can actually start doing it and then plot it into the framework once it's out. So in conclusion, I mean, the last slide I have, I guess, talks about some of the challenges, what we currently are going through and what we anticipate. And I mean, on the next slide, you'll see that the image that I chose to reflect that with the target is that it's really about precision is the challenge. And what's the right level of precision? So if you think about the TCFD versus the TNFD, so carbon, you know, it's a universal problem, but it looks the same in every country. You know, that the metric is clearly defined, but nature and the value of nature is going to be perceived differently for every country and for each community as well. So how do we actually make sure that we capture that appropriately? So even, for example, if you think about the communities that depend on the mangroves in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in the Philippines. You know, you've got a lot of communities there that are totally dependent on mangroves for their livelihood. But their affinity with them is very different to, say, the areas of the US, you know, that also have a similar type of ecosystem. The other challenge is getting the right level of global versus local. And, you know, I can use our own example there. If you recall the picture that you saw of the world map and our biodiversity index. So one of the challenges that we deal with in Australia is, how do you get the right level of country indices or country metrics? So you have a country like Australia, which is the size of Europe. Yet Europe, we can split up into, you know, 40 odd different countries, and you can get a single index for Switzerland, for Germany, for Portugal, which is going to be somewhat, you know, accurate. But then to have a single metric for Australia, where we all know the landscape is so diverse, you know, it's just the challenge is actually getting it to the right level and then breaking it down to a level that we can actually do something with it. And I guess lastly, well, but not our last challenge, is just getting the right balance of simplicity versus complexity. So we do need to make sure that our metrics are meaningful and our actions are going to have impact at the right level. But we also don't want to overcomplicate it. You know, we don't want to have, you know, different systems for each jurisdictions. You know, we already have the number of states and local governments to deal with. And as a global organisation, you know, we certainly don't want to have to do a different reporting mechanism for every country, which is why these, you know, frameworks are just fantastic to be part of. Because the more complex you make it, the harder it's going to be for private sector to come on board and take it on. So the more we can create alignment and create a framework that people can actually integrate their existing practices, then the more effective it's going to be, the sooner people can come on board and we can, you know, get moving. So in closing, I guess just to wrap up on the role that we see of reinsurance and insurance to support a nature positive outcomes. I mean, reinsurance is one of the few truly global industries. So the information that we're collecting, the views that we have, you know, we can spot a lot of these challenges that I've mentioned and inconsistencies, but we can also provide the benchmarks and comparisons from around the world that we can learn from and share. And we can use these insights and data to actually provide solutions, so to help in the planning and the risk and the protection of assets. And we can also use insurance to help de-risk investment. So this is also going to enable more nature positive finance to flow through. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to some questions and discussions and maybe some more solutions from the group as well to help us get there.
Great. Thank you very much, Sheree. And I think a fantastic segue into a broader discussion. So keen now, optimistic sort of note to end on. We've had a huge amount of information, and it's been great to get an update on both where TNFD is up to, where the Australian government's heading with this work. And I think you heard very strongly sort of a shout out for organisations who aren't already involved to become involved and join in one of the many kind of different collaborative efforts in this area. So it's exciting times in natural capital. As I mentioned before, presentations will be available along with the recordings on our website, so you can pass to others in your organisation or rewatch if you're very interested. But thank you everyone for joining. We know it's a very busy time of year, but look forward to reconnecting with you in the new year, and particularly to our panellists. Very insightful conversation, and look forward to seeing everyone early in 2022.
Right, thank you. Good talk.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thanks, Christy. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.